Welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens. We're going to talk about whether China is starting to lose its grip on Asia. And this has a lot to do with the visit of Biden in Japan just recently, as well as the speech that Antony Blinken did. And so there's a different storyline now from the US to China, which is as if there was an awakening from the US, like more realism about what China is and how China's influence is in Asia and how they can counter it seems to be a new strategy. Is it all talk, or is there going to be some real action happening? If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so. There's almost 100 videos online, and I'm going to continue giving videos or making videos about China every single week. So, will China lose its grip on Asia? I mean, why am I saying this? I mean, China's sphere of influence in Asia has only grown over the past year. So why would I ask that question even? Well, it's all to do with the visit that Biden just did to Japan and South Korea. And so this is again a pivot to Asia. This is a pivot to Asia where he announced during his visit in Japan that he would create, or he has created, a new framework. It's called the IPEF. And IPEF stands for Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And at the same time, he had a visit on the Quad, and the Quad is actually the four big military powers. It's like India, it's Australia, and Japan that are forming one power. And so that was one of the meetings that he did. But very important was this announcement of the IPEF, because he now clearly says that China needs to be actually contained in a way, or actually limited in its sphere of influence. That is what it's all about. It's about having a counterweight against the influence that China has in the region. And so this is why I'm asking this question. Now, if you think about the pivot to Asia, this is not new. I mean, it's not Biden who created that first plan. Under Obama already in 2016, it was very clear that Obama went closer and closer to Asia. I mean, he did join or be part of the TPP, which was a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was really about a lot of Southeast Asian countries, including Japan and also the United States and some countries in America like Chile and Peru and so on, and Mexico. And so this was all about having a big trade agreement, but going beyond trade. This was really about values, about security, and so about democracies. And so this was already in 2016 put into place. And also his approach towards ASEAN, ASEAN, so all the Southeast Asian countries, pretty much everything under China and above Australia, formed one big group that Obama went closer and closer to and had more and more cooperation with. And this was a counterweight against China. Of course, the South China Sea, we know all about that since 2016. There's been a lot of tensions in the South China Sea because China has militarized some islands like the Spratly Islands. I mean, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, they're all been claiming some of these islands, and China has been claiming it from their history, and then the US intervened and they went to court even, and China lost actually that lawsuit, but basically it doesn't have any legal base, so they're just continuing it. But on the other hand, I mean, there's promises being made, and it's just a cat and mouse game. And so I've written a lot about that in my book, so I'm not going to go into detail there, but it's really about they're both blaming the US and China, the other one, to do the first step and actually not to be lawful or legal. And so this is one of the things, but you surely saw 6 years ago already this pivot to Asia. But then when Trump bailed out of the TPP, when he was president, just started, he bailed out instantly with an executive order. He just said, I'm out of here. And so that means that the TPP was actually probably going to die. And they revived it, they reanimated it and called it the CPTPP. I mean, what's in an acronym? I mean, it's like comprehensive, progressive TPP. And so this is all about the same countries that are trying to revive it. And China is now trying to join that CPTPP as well. And so this is about more than economics. If you purely look at economics and trade, what you see is that there's already a framework in place called the RCEP. And this is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And this is really already a framework where pretty much every country in Asia, I mean, in the east of Asia, is actually completely already agreeing on free trade agreements. So the whole Southeast Asia, there's Japan, there's all the countries like Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So there's a lot of countries in there already who've kind of agreed to do free trade. And so if there's so many agreements, the CPTPP, which is still alive, the RCEP that is also alive, Asian, which is also creating a lot of frameworks and agreements, why would you need a new one called IPEF? Well, one of the reasons is, of course, that Biden doesn't want to revive something that Trump pulled out of, because if he might come back into power in 2 years, maybe he's going to bail out of it again, so it's better to build something else. But it's also because it's clearly that Biden wants to do a flavor of his own. And this also, 6 years later, the environment and the world has changed. And so the RCEP, the CPTPP and the Asian, if you look at it, I mean, all the countries in Asia are part of 2 or 3 of all of them. And so this is interesting mix, but it all has to do with either it's trade or it's actually something more than trade, which could be like values and rights and laws and like labor laws and so on. And so this is like more than like a European Union in Asia. So where the RCEP is purely economic and trade, the CPTPP wants to go a lot further, and Asian is already, with Southeast Asian countries, already forming a bloc like the European Union within the Southeast Asian countries. And so this is all formed already. So the IPEF basically is just one more thing. Why make it more complicated even? But there is a clear reason why he's doing that. The reason that American Biden is doing that is basically to actually not have China included in the next evolution of the world, or the world order as is being shaped as we talk. And so the first partners that he took was his strongest partner, the Quad, and partners that he has great relationship with, or America has. The Quad is Australia, India, and Japan. And so this is a military alliance, let's not forget it. And so the IPEF has a lot of military flavor in there. It's a lot about security. And then there's New Zealand, who also joined as member of the IPEF. And New Zealand, together with Australia and Japan, they have real issues with the Pacific Islands, like the Solomon Islands, because just recently they went closer to China for bilateral security agreements. And of course, this is not something Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and all the other countries close to it want that. So there's a lot of tensions happening there, where certain countries are starting to shift their priorities. There's countries like South Korea, where the president, Yoon Suk-yeol, he really is getting closer to America. But then on the other hand, if you look at the new prime minister in Australia, Anthony Albanese, you see that he is actually getting more closer to China again. And then the Solomon is getting close. And so it's constant change. Once there's another election, actually somebody goes closer to China and someone else is actually moving away a little bit from China. And so, but it's very important for Biden and for America that South Korea, strong economies, Japan, but also India, the biggest democracy in the world in numbers of people, as well as New Zealand, and so on, that they form these pillars for the future of this framework. Otherwise, it wouldn't probably continue to exist. But they've also managed, besides these 6 countries, including the US, to actually attract 7 countries in Asia, so in the Southeast Asia. And if you look at the numbers, pure economically, and you look at all the countries in the IPEF that are doing business or trade with the US, and you look at them doing trade with China, all of them, no exceptions, have like 2 to 3 times more trade with China in the region than with the US. And with Australia, it's even 5 times bigger with China than with the US. And so from a US-American point of view, it's very clear that US is losing its grip on Asia from an economic point of view. And economy also means politic power, and it also means military power. And so yes, this is a lot to do with joining all these countries together against somehow China, because autocracies are clearly not included in this IPEF. I mean, countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, although theoretically they can join, it's very unlikely they will be able to join, including China, just because it's not part of one of these democracies, which the US is always talking about. And so this is a change in alliances and forming alliances together. And it's a lot, as I said, against China. This is also why they call it Indo-Pacific Framework, economic framework, and not Asia-Pacific economic framework. What's the difference? I mean, whenever you hear the words Indo-Pacific, it's very clear that China is not included. I mean, Indo focuses on India, so that's why it's so important for the IPEF that India would join or is joining this IPEF, because it's called the Indo-Pacific. But this is about the Asia-Pacific or the Pacific Ocean together with the Indian Ocean. But it's actually the same thing, except that India is included, but it shows that China is not included. That is actually the rhetoric. So whenever you hear Indo-Pacific, this is an American-driven or American-led initiative. When you hear Asia-Pacific, it's probably including China in some fashion. And so then you have the question of Taiwan, because Taiwan also wanted to join this IPEF. They saw their chance, their opportunity to be part of this new framework. Of course, that's not something Biden can agree on, because otherwise he would be in direct conflict and confrontation with China. And that would not just be a counterweight, the whole IPEF, but it would actually create maybe a new Cold War or a hot war. And so this is really something that Biden has to be very careful about. He made some mistakes when he pronounced that he would support the military in case of an invasion or in case of an attack. And so yes, they're very careful these days, because any word saying wrong could actually escalate. But this is all to do about creating alliances. And the reason that this IPEF might not reach its potential is because there's zero trade in it. This is not about free trade. So if you don't get access to the American markets by joining this framework, it's really a lot about things around that, and the biggest value is not there. It's also not multilateral, which means some countries will join for some things, but it's not all these countries agreeing to everything at the same time. So what do they need to agree on, and what is this IPEF all about? Well, there's 4 big pillars. And the first one has to do with connectivity, and this is about the digital democracies. This is about sharing information and going digital together to actually enhance and go into Industry 4.0 and that new world that is being created completely, the meta world or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's all about the new world, the smart world that they want to create with all these partners together. And so you could join that if you want to go really in the direction of digital as a country. If as a country, let's say Singapore, or maybe in other places, in Thailand or Vietnam, they say, yeah, we want to join the resilient pillar of this whole framework. This is all about supply chains. So either it's about digital or it's about supply chains. You can join that chair of supply chains, because there's so many problems of supply chains which have been created according to the US, partially or primarily because of the lockdowns in Shanghai and the issues of supply chains from China, the dependency on China. What that means is that they're trying to figure out other countries to help the US and help the world to keep the supply chain going, even if China doesn't cooperate. And so that's the second pillar. The third one has everything to do with clean and green and sustainability. And I think most countries in that region will be more than willing to join that chapter, because this is really about the future of the world, and it's about what many countries stand by. So they will join that one. And then the last one has to do with fair, everything which is about fairness. This is about more transparency, more openness. It's a lot to do with anti-corruption, with, I mean, all the things that maybe China is not tackling well enough according to the US. If you want to have something then around that topic, you can join that. And so the interesting thing about the IPEF is that there's 4 pillars, and any country of these 13 partners can actually join whatever pillar or chapter they want, but then they have to agree to everything put into that framework and according to that. So it's kind of a commitment if you join each of them, any of them, and then you have to follow through. And so this is like pick cherry, and you can pick whatever you want, and you like this or you don't like that. I mean, you go for the ones that you want. And so the reason that Biden is doing it this way is because if he would ask everything from all the countries at one, being completely multilateral in agreement, he would never reach a deal. And so he'd been spreading this out in 4 parts to say, well, if I get 3 countries there that do this, and 3 countries that do that, and maybe 6 doing that, and 2 doing that, I mean, we have some alliance and agreement on everything, and then we can make this framework work. So I call this the D13 right now, which is like the G7, which is kind of like blah, blah, blah very often, and they talk and they get together, but the reality is that will real things happen? Because if you don't have China on board in all of this, I mean, the impact will be limited still. And so specifically if you go to the supply chain, you go to digital, or you go to clean or renewables, I mean, China is so important in all of these. So excluding China, I'm not so sure if it's that powerful as an agreement. But what's behind it all is, of course, a security and military alliance that is being created slowly. And so this is why I call it D13. This is about maybe the democracies, it's about division of countries. It's about dividing the alliances on one side with China and some of its partners on the other side. So it's autocracies versus democracies. So this is a D13 in my view. And there's going to be a lot of these meetings, and it's going to take 12 to 18 months before the first frameworks are actually set in stone and some countries have committed to it. Maybe it's going to take longer even. So by then, maybe Biden's not in office anymore. So will this really take place? We'll see that. And it depends whether Trump or anybody else is back in charge in a year or two from now, or that will be completely different. But for me, this is all about unite and divide. And so this is about uniting the countries that have similar values from a US point of view, similar aspirations, and then divide that world with the China-influenced world. It's pretty simple. And what will be the impact on China? I think there's two big impacts that could have, in my view. One is on the standards, because this is going to be a lot about digital. And so this is about norms and standards. And so when you think about quantum, I mean, there's already a NATO cybersecurity where it's not just the countries in Europe, it's also in Japan and South Korea. There's also now a quantum alliance that France and Germany and the US and the UK and some big countries with Japan are creating an alliance where China is not included. So what you're starting to see is that standards are getting set without China. And so this is really about dividing two standards. What you also see is that Taiwan is now becoming a very, very tricky situation, because with this more security in Japan and South Korea that is happening due to this IPEF, as well as all the change that is happening, I mean, Taiwan becomes the big question: what is going to happen? Now, Biden clearly said, and so did Antony Blinken, that there's the one China policy, they're not deviating from it, and so they won't change that. But the reality is that if anything goes wrong, Taiwan might be the first place where things go wrong. And so this is all looking very strange. So could escalate the Taiwan issue. It could divide actually the standards and technology matters, where cooperation and collaboration might actually be without China in the future when it comes to tech. From a Chinese perspective, and many people say that, is that there's a lot of guns and no butter. What that means is that it's a lot about security and military. They just call it digital, they call it things like clean, and they call it like supply chain or resilient. But the reality, it's all about creating this military alliance, because quantum and all these things is going to be very important. It's also about providing information to all these countries from the US, or insights, intel, as they call in the military language or lingo. And so then the big question is, if it's going to take 2 years or longer maybe to really get something going, if there's no real economic benefit, so there's no butter, as they say, and it's purely about creating this security alliance, what is going to happen if Trump ever comes back in office? I mean, is this going to survive? And so in my view, this IPEF is a real attempt and could actually create some real impact on China in moving ahead when it comes to technology and having a higher security alertness for the future, and something could go wrong. But from an economic point of view, I don't think a lot will change because of the IPEF, but that's just my personal view. Now, what's also interesting is just one day after the visit of Biden to Japan, to Asia, which was his first big visit that he already anticipated for a long time, but because of the war in Ukraine and Afghanistan and other things, he had to delay it always. You saw that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, really started creating a very different tone. And so I think you have to combine these two. You have to combine the IPEF, new framework, together with what Antony Blinken said. And so he really was talking about creating more alliances with a lot of countries, but also create more cooperation with China. What I felt with this 45-minute speech that he gave, which is really interesting, I really encourage you to look at the speech. I'm going to put the link below that. It's on YouTube as well. And he really expressed lots of things that I would never have thought that would come out of a state secretary from the US. And this was really about suddenly realizing that they now need alliances, they need partners to fight China. Well, before, until just a few months ago, before the war in Ukraine, it was very direct confrontation between China and the US. And China responded very directly. And so this became very like a Cold War environment almost, and everything was blocked. And Blinken said in his story, in his speech, the complete opposite. I mean, he, of course, reiterated many of the points that China's doing wrong. I mean, human rights and being assertive and being unfair, and we know all this. But he also said things that China will stay. And China, they're not intended to change China or block China as long as it benefits the world, it benefits the US. And so there was a different tone. He was talking, of course, again about this rule-based order. And, you know, I mean, this is when the US is basically don't want to talk about the international law. They talk about the rules-based law, because this is about democracies. This is about the alliances in the West. But now they seem to, with the IPEF, to create the same alliances in the East. And so this is about new things. But he said he wants to go back to diplomacy. And for me, this is really a great sign of hope, because this is what China has been wanting for years, is to go back to diplomacy. But the previous state secretary under Trump, which was Mike Pompeo, I mean, this was all about confrontation. And it seemed that Biden was continuing this. But now it seems they want to talk. They seem to accept. They actually feel more realism. They feel that China is not going to go away. It's going to continue growing in economic power, in military and political power. And so now they need counterweights. And so now the story is like, we need to get friends. We need to get friends in Asia. And they do that by not making it difficult. The IPEF is very easy. It's not a big commitment for many countries to join. And so they want to go slow. And they basically are talking really about investing. They also want to align and they want to compete. That's the three big words. So invest is all about investing in its own country and the US. This is the Build Back Better strategy that Biden has. And this is about making US strong again from the inside, not by blaming China or blocking China or changing China, but actually looking on their own. And this is a positive sign. But the question is, it's not because they did that 50, 70 years ago that they can do that again today at the same pace and the same way, because the Chinese workers might not be willing to work and the same effort that they did at that point. But then there's also not just the invest, but the align. And so this is really where it's about whenever the world benefits or the US benefits and the China benefits, there has to be an alignment. This is about coming together. And this is something on climate that they've been saying for a long time, but it looks like they're going to go further on technology cooperation. Antony Blinken was even talking about how great it is to have Chinese students in America and that they shouldn't be hated and no racism is allowed. And so it's a very different tone, very interesting. But at the same time, he made it very clear that they still have to compete and protect their own interests in the US. And that makes total sense as well. But there's going to be something in between. But it looks like he was saying, and with Biden's IPEF, it's like, let's not make war, let's not stop the conflict, let's just get along together. But in the meantime, we're going to try and get as many friends as we have to actually make sure that you don't grow much faster. And that is the U is China. Now, that, in my view, that invest, that align and compete is actually almost a China strategy from the global point of view. And so they've always been investing much in their own country, China. They've been trying to align with countries that are friendly to China, and they've been very competitive with those that they can compete against. So it's a China strategy in the US almost. And on top of that, there's security involved, which is really about protecting the whole region. And so what I think is that China is going to go more and more the economic path to actually keep its grip on Asia, while the US is going to try every path they can to actually get more influence in Asia. And so I don't believe that China will lose its grip on Asia, but it's clear that the US is now focused on Asia, and They were very much focused on Ukraine and still are for the past 3 months, but it looks like that page has turned, and right now they're going back to the old strategy that Asia is the biggest challenge for the US, and they need to find friends to actually compete with China. They can't do it on their own anymore. And this is what made a big difference between this week and just a week ago.